Hello and welcome
to the Vault of Horror.
I'm Chris, and it's October. So what that means is every year, 31 movies in 31 days. So we did a video on this a couple years back. Make sure you check that out if you don't understand it. But in a nutshell, what I do is watch 31 movies every October. At least half of them need to be movies I've never seen before. So we're going to get right into it. The first movie I watched this year was Digging Up The Marrow, directed by Adam Green, who did the Hatchet series, as well as a really great hidden gem called Frozen. I actually almost shut this off. I thought I had mistakenly started watching a documentary. That's not the case. This is an actual movie. It's just done more so in that like mockumentary style. The acting in it is somewhat hit or miss. Ray Wise is in the starring role and he really carries the movie, but Adam Green cast himself kind of playing himself in this movie, and that doesn't really work that great. They even crack a joke about it early on, that he should have hired an actor to play himself in it. Not a lot happens for the majority of the movie. You do get one scare that's almost kind of cheesy, and they save the best parts for the end. I do wish they would have incorporated some of the elements from the end into earlier parts of the movie, just to kind of keep it going a little bit. It does feel very flat for the majority of it. As is the case with most of Green's work, this is for horror enthusiasts, so the true fans will appreciate this. For most of you, this is one you could probably skip. Okay, so the next movie I watched was The Lighthouse. It's a 2019 film inspired by the works of several inspirational 19th century literary figures, including Edgar Allan Poe, and it is filmed in a square aspect ratio. They definitely went for style over substance. The plot is a little difficult to follow. It's one of those like, where are they going with this kind of movies? It's very suggestive. I'll just leave it at that. It was critically acclaimed for being this kind of work of art, but I also heard a lot of very bad things about it. And I've got to say, I sort of have mixed emotions. I don't think it's great, but I don't think it was a total waste of time either. And then next I watched another Adam Green film, Victor Crowley, which is the fourth movie in the Hatchet series. They're basically this love letter to 80s slasher cinema. Takes place 10 years after the original. It's probably the weakest of the Hatchet sequels, but that's not to say it's bad. But if you've seen the other ones, this is just par for the course. Next, I watched an Amicus movie, Dr. Terror's House of Horrors. I find it ironic that it has house in the title, but the entire thing takes place on a train. So if you're unfamiliar with Amicus, it was basically a studio created in the 70s to sort of capitalize off of the success of Hammer. But one thing they did was, in order to save money on the budget, these were set in what was then modern day. There are several Amicus anthology films. This was the last of them that I had not yet seen. It stars Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee, as well as a young Donald Sutherland. Cushing plays this doctor who does these tarot readings for the other passengers on the train, which then become our story segments. 5 in total. The third one is really bad and it just drags on, but the other 4 are really good and I really enjoyed this movie. I would describe it as schlocky but fun. The Invisible Man from 2020. Universal has been desperately trying to create what they are calling the Dark Universe. It is a modern-day Universal monster equivalent to what we see with the Marvel movies, where they have the cinematic universe, and they're going to do crossovers and all that, so they're trying to establish these characters. It started off with Dracula Untold, which was a total commercial failure, and then they wiped the slate clean and said that doesn't count. Then they gave us that Tom Cruise version of The Mummy, which was a total flop. Then they started talking about erasing all of that and starting over yet again. So then they gave us this remake of The Invisible Man, and I've got to say, this one's really good. I don't really care for the way they obviously dubbed the Invisible Man's voice in post. It just sounds a little bit out of place. But it's the story of this woman who leaves her boyfriend in the middle of the night. He's wealthy, he then commits suicide, and he leaves her an inheritance of $5 million. It does a really good job of creating suspense. I love the way they have these sort of anchored camera pans that where it pans over to nothing. And it begs the question, is this woman actually sensing that something is there, or is she going crazy? For the most part, this was done really well, and hopefully this is something to build off of for this dark universe concept, and maybe they can eventually get this right. But I think at the same time, they're sort of trying to force it a little too much. They have old properties, the old films from the 30s, 40s, 50s. They've done remakes. There was the 1999 Brendan Fraser version of The Mummy, which had sequels and spin-offs and everything. There was the 2010 version of The Wolfman. Not all of those are the most popular things in the world. It doesn't have to be completely canon, but use that as your foundation. There's stuff there. We don't need these movies to remind us that the universal monsters exist. The 2019 remake of Pet Sematary. It certainly lacks the luster of the original, but I've got to say the resurrected kid does deliver a nice, creepy performance that sort of adds to it a bit, and the cast does a really good job. I really like John Lithgow as the neighbor Judd. He was almost unrecognizable at first. Pet Sematary isn't necessarily one of my favorite movies ever. What was that noise? Anyway, the original wasn't necessarily one of my favorite movies of all time, but it is one of the earliest horror films I do recall watching. So for that reason alone, it does kind of have a nostalgic value to me. I feel like if you're going to remake a movie, it needs to be its own thing. This feels like a beat-for-beat retelling of the original, and the only time they stray from what the original did, it's like they're trying to use it for shock value. This doesn't feel like it's made for fans of the original. Well, who is this for then? It wasn't terrible, but it is extremely forgettable. And then, for reasons I can't really explain, the next movie I watched was the 2019 remake of Child's Play. I had heard pretty much nothing but bad things about this, but it was the only Child's Play film that I had yet to see, so I decided to watch it. I've got to say, I think this is far better than people give it credit for. It's no masterpiece by any stretch, but it's far from the worst Child's Play movie. There's a scene in there where they're watching Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, which is a vastly superior film. So this franchise has just always been hit or miss. We had the original trilogy, which ended on a very sour note. Nobody really liked the third one. Then they reinvented it by making the Chucky the star of the films with Bride of Chucky and Seed of Chucky. And now in recent years, they've sort of been reinventing it. And all the way along, it has just really felt like hit or miss. And now they're rebooting it. I don't understand why it felt like they were trying to reestablish this franchise in recent years, only to like wipe the slate clean and restart the whole thing. And the last film on our list today, Demons of the Mind from Hammer. I've heard this one described as one of the last truly great Hammer outings, and I think that's a pretty fair assessment. Compared to most of what they were doing during the 1970s, a lot of it felt very behind the times. Think of other things that were coming out at that time. There was psychological horror movies were big then, like Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist. The Italian giallo films were becoming very big at that time. Zombie movies were coming into prominence. The tail end of the 70s, we saw things like John Carpenter's Halloween, which really thrust slasher films into the forefront. As it felt like Hammer was losing touch, this one kind of gets lost in the shuffle. It is a period piece set in the 19th century, but I would say what sets it apart from other Hammer films of that time is this really unsettling atmosphere that it has. It does have some of the gothic imagery you would expect of a Hammer film, so it kind of feels right at home, but it's one of the more unique ones that they did, I think. So it's about this man whose wife is deceased and she had suffered from mental illness, and he's now worried that their two grown children will suffer the same fate. So he hires this doctor to monitor them. There's also a murderer on the loose. So it's kind of one of the last really great Hammer films during that original run.